Atreyu's mission. Because of their special importance, the deliberations concerning the welfare of all Fantasticans were held in the great throne room of the palace, which was situated only a few floors below the Magnolia Pavilion. The large circular room was filled with muffled voices. The 499 best doctors in Fantastica had assembled there and were whispering or mumbling with one another in groups of varying sizes. Each one had examined the childlike empress, some more recently than others, and each had tried to help her with his particular skill, but none had succeeded. None knew the nature of the cause of her illness, and none could think of a cure for it. Just then, the 500th Doctor, the most famous in all Fantastica, whose knowledge was said to embrace every existing medicinal herb, every magic filter, and every secret of nature, was examining the patient. He had been with her for several hours, and all his assembled colleagues were eagerly awaiting the results of his examination. Of course, this assembly was nothing like a human medical congress. To be sure, a good many of the inhabitants of Fantastica were more or less human in appearance, but at least as many resembled animals or were even further from human. The doctors inside the hall were just as varied as the crowd of messengers milling around outside. There were dwarf doctors with white beards and humps. There were fairy doctresses in shimmering silvery blue robes with glittering stars in their hair. There were water sprites with big round bellies and webbed hands and feet. There were white snakes who had coiled up on the long table at the center of the room. There were witches, vampires, ghosts, none of whom are generally reputed to be especially benevolent or conducive to good health. If you were to understand why these last were present, there is one thing you have to know. The childlike empress, as her title indicates, was looked upon as the ruler over all the innumerable provinces of Fantastic and Empire. But in reality, she was far more than a ruler. She was something entirely different. She didn't rule. She had never used force or made use of her power. She never issued commands, and she never judged anyone. She had never interfered with anyone and never had to defend herself against any assailant, for no one would have thought of rebelling against her or harming her in any way. In her eyes, all her subjects were equal. She was simply there in a special way. She was the center of all life in Fantastica. And every creature, whether good or bad, beautiful or ugly, merry or solemn, foolish or wise, all owed their existence to her existence. Without her, nothing could have lived, any more than a human body can live if it lost its heart. All knew this to be so, though no one fully understood her secret. Thus she was respected by all the creatures of the Empire, and her health was of equal concern to all of them. For her death would have meant the end of all of them, the end of the boundless Fantastican realm. Bastion's thoughts wandered. Suddenly he remembered the long corridor in the hospital where his mother had been operated on. He and his father sat there waiting for hours outside the operating room. Doctors and nurses hurried this way and that way. When his father asked about his wife, the answer was always evasive. No one really seemed to know what was going on. Finally, a bald-headed man in a white smock came out to them. He looked tired and sad. Much as he regretted it, he said his efforts had been in vain. He had pressed their hands and mumbled something about heartfelt sympathy. After that, everything had changed between Bastion and his father. Not outwardly. Bastion had everything he could have wished for. He had a 3-speed bike, an electric train, plenty of vitamins, 53 books, a golden hamster, an aquarium with a tropical fish, a small camera, 6 pocket knives, and so forth. But none of all this really meant anything to him. Bastion remembered that his father had often played with him in the past. He'd even told him stories. No longer. He couldn't talk to his father anymore. There was an invisible wall around his father, and no one could get through to him. He never found fault, and he never praised him. Even when Bastien was put back in school, his father hadn't said anything, not one word. He'd only looked at him in his sad, absent way. Bastien felt, as far as his father was concerned, he wasn't even there. That was how his father usually made him feel. When they sat in front of the television screen in the evening, Bastien saw his father wasn't even looking at it. His thoughts were far away. Or even when they both sat there with books, Bastien saw his father wasn't even reading them. He'd been looking at the same page for hours and had forgotten to turn it. Bastien knew his father was sad. He himself had cried for many nights. Sometimes he had been so shaken by sobs that he had to vomit. And after all, he was still there. Why didn't his father ever speak to him? Not about his mother, not about important things, but just for the feel of talking together. "If only we knew," said a tall, thin fire sprite with a beard of red flames. "If only we knew what her illness was. There is no fever, no swelling, no rash, no inflammation. She just seems to be fading away. No one knows." As he spoke, little clouds of smoke came out of his mouth and formed figures. This time they were question marks. A bedraggled old raven who looked like a potato with feathers stuck onto it every which way answered in a croaking voice. He was a head cold and sore throat specialist. "She doesn't even cough. She hasn't got a cold. Medically speaking, it's no disease at all." He adjusted the big spectacles on his beak and cast a challenging look around. "One thing seems obvious," buzzed a scarab, a beetle sometimes known as a pill roller. "There is some mysterious connection between her illness and the terrible happenings these messengers from all Fantastica have been reporting." "Oh, yes," scoffed an ink goblin. "You see the mysterious connection everywhere."
"My dear colleagues,"
pleaded a hollow-cheeked ghost in a long white gown,
"let's not get personal. Such remarks are quite irrelevant, and please lower your voices."
Conversation of this kind were going on in every part of the throne room. It may seem strange that creatures of so many different kinds were able to communicate one with another, but nearly all inhabitants of Fantastica, even the animals, knew at least two languages: their own, which they spoke only with members of their own species and which no outsider understood, and the universal language known as High Fantastican. All Fantasticans used it, though some in a rather particular way. Suddenly all fell silent, for a great double door had opened. In stepped Chiron, a far-famed master of the healer's art. He was in what older times had been called a centaur. He had the body of a man from the waist up, and that of a horse from the waist down. And Chiron was furthermore a black centaur. He hailed from the remote region far to the south, and his human half was the color of ebony. Only his curly hair and beard were white, while the horse-like half of him was striped like a zebra. He was wearing a strange hat plated of reeds. A large golden amulet hung from a chain around his neck, and on the amulet one could make out two snakes, one light and one dark, which were biting each other's tails to form an oval. Everyone in Fantastica knew what the medallion meant. It was the badge of one acting on orders from the childlike Empress, acting in her name as though she herself were present. It was said to give the bearer mysterious powers. Though no one knew exactly what these powers were, everyone knew its name, Arin. But many who feared to pronounce the name called it the gem or the glory. In other words, The book bore the mark of the childlike empress. A whispering passed through the throne room, and some of the doctors were heard to cry out. The gem had not been entrusted to anyone for a long, long time. Chiron stamped his hooves 2 or 3 times. When the disorder subsided, he said in a deep voice,
Friends, don't be too upset. I shall only be wearing Orn for a short time. I am merely a go-between. Soon I shall pass the gem to one worthier.
A breathless silence filled the room.
I won't try to misrepresent our defeat with high-sounding words. The childlike empress's illness has baffled us all. The one thing we knew is that the destruction of Fantastica began at the same time as this illness. We can't even be sure that medical science can even save her. But it is possible, and I hope none of you will be offended at what I'm going to say. It is possible that we who are gathered here do not possess all knowledge, all wisdom. Indeed, it is my last and only hope that somewhere in this unbounded realm there is a being wiser than we are, one who can give us hope and advice. Of course, there is no more than just a possibility, but one thing is certain. The search for this savior calls for a pathfinder, someone who is capable of finding paths in the pathless wilderness, and one who will shrink from no danger or hardship. In other words, a hero. And the childlike empress has given me the name of this hero, to whom she entrusts her salvation and ours. His name is Atreyu. He lives in the grassy ocean beyond the Silver Mountain. I shall transmit Auron to him and send him on the great quest. Now you know all there is to know. With that, the old centaur thumped out of the room. Those who remained behind exchanged looks of bewilderment. What was this hero's name? One asked.
Atreyu, or something of the kind,
Said another.
Never heard of him,
Said the third. And all 499 doctors shook their heads in dismay. The clock in the belfry struck 10. Bastian was amazed at how quickly the time had passed. In class, every hour seemed to drag on for an eternity. Down below, they would be having history with Mr. Drone, a gangling, ordinary, ill-tempered man, who delighted in holding Bastian up to ridicule because he couldn't remember the dates when certain battles had fought or someone or other had resigned. The grassy ocean behind the Silver Mountains was many days' journey from the ivory tower. It was actually a prairie, as long and wide and as flat as the ocean. Its whole expanse was covered with tall, juicy grass, and when the wind blew, great waves passed over it with a sound like troubled water. The people who lived there were known as the Grass People, or the Greenskins. They had blue-black hair, which the men, as well as the women, were long and often in pigtails, and their skin was olive green. They led a hard, frugal life, and their children, girls as well as boys, were brought up to be brave, proud, and generous. They learned to bear heat, cold, and any great hardship, and were tested for courage at an early age. This was necessary because the Greenskins were a nation of hunters. They obtained everything they needed either from the hard, fibrous prairie grass or from the purple buffaloes, great herds of which roamed the grassy ocean. These purple buffaloes were about twice the size of a common bull or cows. They had long purplish red hair with a silky sheen and enormous horns with tips as hard and sharp as daggers. They were peaceful as a rule, but when they scented danger or they thought they were being attacked, they could be as terrible as a natural cataclysm. Only a greenskin would have dared to hunt these beasts, and moreover, they used no other weapon than a bow and arrow. The greenskins were believers in chivalrous combat, and often it was not the hunted, but the hunter who lost his life. Greenskins loved and honored the purple buffaloes and held that only those willing to be killed by them would have the right to kill them. News of the childlike empress's illness and the danger threatening all of Fantastica had not yet reached the grassy ocean. It was a long, long time since any traveler had visited the tent colonies of the Greenskins. The grass was juicier than ever, the days were bright, and nights were full of stars. All seemed to be well there. But one day, a white-haired, black centaur appeared. His hide was dripping with sweat, he seemed totally exhausted, and his bearded face was haggard. On his head he wore a strange hat plated of reeds, and around his neck a chain with a golden amulet hanging from it. It was Chiron. He stood in the open space at the center of the successive rings of tents. It was there that the elders held their councils, and that people danced and sang old songs on feast days. He waited for the greenskins to assemble. But it was only very old men and women and small children, wide-eyed with curiosity, who crowded around him. He stamped his hooves impatiently.
"Where are the hunters and huntresses?"
He panted, removing his hat and wiping his forehead. A white-haired woman with a baby in her arms replied, "They are still hunting. They won't be back for 3 or 4 days."
"Is Atreyu with them?"
the centaur asked. "Yes, stranger, but how can it be that you know of him?"
"I don't know him. Now go get him."
Stranger?
said an old man on crutches.
He will come unwillingly. But this is his hunt. It starts at sunset. Do you know what that means?
Chiron shook his mane and stamped his hooves.
"I don't know, and it doesn't matter. He has something far more important to do now. You know this sign I am wearing. Go and get him."
"We see the gem," said a little girl. "We know you have come from the childlike empress. But who are you?"
"My name is Chiron. Chiron the physician, if that means anything to you."
A bent old woman pushed forward and cried out,
Yes, it is true. I recognize him.
"I saw him once when I was very young. He is the greatest and most famous doctor in all of Fantastica." The centaur nodded.
"Thank you, my good woman," he said. "And now perhaps one of you will at last be kind enough to go bring this Atreyu here. It's urgent. The life of the childlike empress is at stake."
"I'll go," cried a little girl, 5 or 6. She ran away, and a few seconds later she could be seen between the tents galloping away on a saddled horse.
"At last,"
Chiron grumbled. Then he fell into a dead faint. When he revived, he didn't know where he was, for all was dark around him. It came to him only little by little that he was in a large tent lying on a bed of soft furs. It seemed to be night, for though a cleft in the door curtain, he saw flickering firelight.
"Holy horseshoes," he muttered, trying to sit up. "How long have I been here?"
A head looked in through the door opening and pulled back again. Someone said,
Yes, he seems to be awake.
Then the curtain was drawn aside and a boy of about 10 stepped in. His long trousers and shoes were of soft buffalo leather. His body was bare from the waist up, but a long purple-red cloak, evidently woven from buffalo hair, hung from his shoulders. His long blue-black hair was gathered together and held by a long leather thong. A few simple white designs were painted on the olive-green skin of his cheeks and forehead. His dark eyes flashed angrily at the intruder. Otherwise, his feathers betrayed no emotion of any kind. "What do you want of me, stranger?" he asked. "Why have you come to my tent? And why have you robbed me of my hunt? If If I had killed the big buffalo today, and my arrow was already fitted to my bowstring, I'd have been a hunter tomorrow. Now I'll have to wait a whole year. Why? The old centaur stared at him in consternation.
Am I to take it, he asked, that you are Atreyu?
That's right, stranger.
Isn't there someone else of the same name? A grown man? An experienced hunter?
No, I and no one else am Atreyu. Sinking back on his bed of furs, old Chiron gasped.
A child? A little boy? Really, the decisions of the childlike empress are hard to fathom.
Atreyu waited in impassive silence.
Forgive me, Atreyu, said Chiron,
Controlling his agitation with the greatest of difficulty.
I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, but the surprise has been just too great. Frankly, I'm horrified. I don't know what to think. I can't help but wonder, did the childlike empress really know what she was doing when she chose a youngster? It's sheer madness. And if she did it intentionally, then...
With a violent shake of his head, he blurted out,
No! No! If I had known who she was sending me to, I'd have refused to entrust you with the mission. I'd refuse.
What mission? Atreyu asked.
It's monstrous,
Cried Chiron indignantly.
It's doubtful whether even the greatest, most experienced of heroes could carry out this mission. And you? She sends you into the unfathomable to look for the unknown? No one can help you. No one can advise you. No one can foresee what will befall you. And yet you must decide at once, immediately, whether or not you accept the mission. There's not a moment to be lost. For 10 days and nights I have galloped almost without rest to reach you. But now I almost wish I hadn't gotten here. I'm very old. I'm at the end of my strength. Give me a drink of water, please.
Atreyu brought a pitcher of fresh spring water. The centaur drank deeply. Then he wiped his beard and said somewhat more calmly,
Thank you. That was good. I feel a little better already. Listen to me, Atreyu. You don't have to accept the mission. The childlike empress leaves it entirely up to you. She never gives orders. I'll tell her how it is, and she'll find someone else. She can't have known you were a little boy. She must have got you mixed up with someone else. That's the only explanation.
What is this mission? Asked Atreyu.
To find a cure for the childlike empress, the centaur answered, and save Fantastica.
Is she sick? Atreyu asked in amazement. Chiron told him how it was with the childlike empress and what the messengers had reported from all parts of Fantastica. Atreyu asked many questions, and the centaur answered them to the best of his ability. They talked far into the night, and the more Atreyu learned of the menace facing Fantastica, the more his face, which at first had been so impassive, expressed unveiled horror.
To think, he murmured finally with his pale lips. I knew nothing about it.
Chiron cast a grave, anxious look at the boy from under his bushy white eyebrows.
Now you know the lie of the land, he said. And now, perhaps you understand why I was so upset when I first laid eyes on you. Still, it was you the childlike empress named. Go and find Atreyu, she said to me. I put all my trust in him, she said. Ask him if he's willing to attempt the great quest for me in all Fantastica. I don't know why she chose you. Maybe only a little boy like you can do whatever has to be done. I don't know. I can't advise you.
Atreyu sat there, with bowed head, made no reply. He realized that this was a far greater task than his hunt. It was doubtful whether the greatest hunter and pathfinder could succeed. How then could he hope?
Well,
the centaur asked. Atreyu raised his head, looked up at him.
I will,
he said firmly. Chiron nodded gravely. Then he took the chain with the golden amulet from around his neck and put it around Atreyu's. Auron gives you great power, he said firmly. But you must not make use of it, for the childlike Empress herself never makes use of her power. Auron will protect you and guide you. But whatever comes your way, you must never interfere, because from this moment on, your own opinion ceases to count. For that same reason, you must go unarmed. You must let whatever happens, happen. Everything must be equal in your eyes. Good and evil. Beautiful and ugly. Foolish and wise, just as it is in the eyes of the childlike Empress. You may only search and inquire, never judge. Always remember that, Atreyu. All right. Atreyu repeated with awe. I will be worthy of the glory. When should I start? Immediately, said Chiron. No one knows how long the great quest will be. Every hour may count, even now. Say goodbye to your parents and your brothers and sisters. I have none, said Atreyu. My parents were both killed by buffalo soon after I was born. Who brought you up? All the men and women together. That's why they call me Atreyu, which in our language means son of all. No one knew better than Bastian at what that meant. Even though his father was still alive and Atreyu had neither father nor mother, to make up for it, Atreyu had been brought up by all men and women together and was the son of all, while Bastian had no one and was really nobody's son. All the same, Bastian was glad to have this much in common with Atreyu, because otherwise he resembled him hardly at all, neither physically nor in courage and determination. Yet Bastian too was engaged in a great quest, and didn't know where it would lead him or how it would end. In that case, said the old centaur, you'd better go without saying goodbye. I will stay here and explain. Atreyu's face became leaner and harder than ever. Where should I begin? He asked. Everywhere and nowhere, said Chiron. From now on, you will be on your own, and no one to advise you. And that's how it will be until the end of the great quest, however it may end. Atreyu nodded. Farewell, Chiron. Farewell, Atreyu, and much luck. The boy turned away and was leaving the tent when the centaur called him back. They stood face to face. The old centaur put both hands on Atreyu's shoulders, looked him in the eye with a respectful smile, and said slowly, I think I'm beginning to see why the childlike Empress chose you, Atreyu. The boy lowered his head just a while. Then he went out quickly. Artax, Atreyu whispered, patting his neck. We're going away. Far, far away. No one even knows if we shall ever even come back. The horse nodded his head and gave a brief snort.
Yes, master,
he said.
but what about your hunt?
We're going on a much greater hunt, said Atreyu, swinging himself into the saddle.
Wait, master, said the horse. You've forgotten your weapons. Are you going without your bow and arrow?
Yes, Artax. I have to go unarmed because I am bearing the gem, snorted the horse.
And where are we going?
Wherever you like, Artax, said Atreyu. From this moment on, we shall be on the great quest. With that, they galloped away and were swallowed up by the darkness. And at the same time, in a different part of Fantastica, something happened which went completely unnoticed. Neither Artax nor Atreyu had the slightest inkling of it. On a remote, night-black heath, the darkness condensed into a great shadowy form. It had become so dense that even in the moonless, starless night, it came to look like a big, black body. Its outlines were still unclear, but it stood on 4 legs, and green fire glowed in the eyes of its huge, shaggy head. It lifted up its great snout and stood for a long while, sniffing the air. Then suddenly, it seemed to find the scent it was looking for, and a deep, triumphant growl issued from its throat. And off it ran into the starless night in long, soundless leaps. The clock in the belfry struck 11. From the downstairs corridors arose the shouts of children running out into the playground. Bastian was still squatting cross-legged on the mats. His legs had fallen asleep. He wasn't even a Native American after all. He stood up, took his sandwich and an apple out of his satchel, and paced the floor. He had pins and needles in his feet, which took some time to wake up. Then he climbed onto the horse and straddled it. He imagined he was Atreyu galloping through the night on Artex's back. He leaned forward and rested his head on his horse's neck. "Gee!" he cried. "Artex, run!" Then he became frightened. It had been foolish of him to shout so loud. What if someone heard him? He waited a while and listened, but all he heard was intermingled shouts from the yard. Feeling rather foolish, he climbed down off the horse. Really, he was behaving like a small child. He unwrapped his sandwich and shined the apple on his trousers, but just as he was biting into it, he stopped himself. "Now," he said to himself aloud, "I must carefully apportion my provisions. Who knows how long they will have to last?" With a heavy heart, he wrapped his sandwich and returned it to his satchel along with the apple. Then with a sigh, he settled down on the mats and reached for the book.